Good morning, everybody. I just wanted to give you a couple pieces of information about the evaluation of sources assignment. This is the next phase of the historical investigation. I did change the due date from Monday to Tuesday. That way, if you had questions about the assignment, you'd still have time on Monday to ask. And the good news is this particular portion of the historical investigation is actually very short. So the evaluation of sources is generally about 2 paragraphs of information where you're really contributing a detailed analysis of 2 of the 8 sources that you're using for your historical investigation. So pick kind of your 2 best sources, your juiciest sources. Try to stay away from sources that are encyclopedia type sources or summary type sources or websites where you're not so sure who the author is. All of those kinds of sources stay away from. You want 2 sources where your question may hinge on the way that you analyze these 2 sources. And they may be 2 sources that present counter arguments. They also may be 2 sources that suggest a similar argument but are different types of sources in some way. So you can use the evaluation of sources in a variety of ways, but it helps you add to your argument of what you've already put. Because you're so limited in space for the summary of evidence, you want to be able to add to that. The evaluation of sources can actually help you add to your summary of evidence because you're offering additional information in a more interpretive type of way. So I do have up on the slide the summary of evidence feedback. And just to remind you, the parts of the historical investigation that you have already completed, you've already done the question, the plan of investigation, and the summary of evidence. So you have an idea of how you're going to maybe go about your entire investigation, and you've proposed some research that you've done, and now you want to use that research further in the evaluation of sources. Okay, it's not until the 4th section, which is the analysis section, where in your voice you get to interpret the evidence that you suggested and look at maybe 2 potential answers to your question, kind of weighing the arguments in both. Okay, in the analysis section, you get to do that. So some feedback on the summary of evidence. This is the part you previously did, and everybody should have received from me some oral commentaries about the summary of evidence. So first and foremost, make sure that your summary of evidence is really focused on the question. It's not uncommon for a lot of summaries of evidence to have a lot of background information, just summation about the topic. At this point, you want to take that out of the summary of evidence and ensure that the summary of evidence is really weighing the specific kind of evidence that's going to focus the question. So, for example, when you guys did the Mongols debate, you wouldn't want to necessarily have a question like, to what extent, were the Mongols' legacy, being ruthless, warriors or something like that. You wouldn't want to have the question, be answered by evidence that just was background information about Temujin and some of his childhood and ways that he made decisions and how he came into power. All of that would be stuff that would be important for the person writing the historical investigation to know, but it doesn't necessarily kind of create the evidence that your question is based on. Better evidence would be the way in which Chinggis Khan handled the situation in Persia when the Mongols invaded there and the degree of effect that happened as a result. So that's, sometimes it's more kind of the end part of your summary of evidence where you have to focus a little bit. You can also make sure that your sources are really good. Some of you have sources that are, websites, maybe loose sources, kind of about the topic. Do take the time to go to JSTOR. That is very heavily encouraged. JSTOR has very scholarly articles, generally about a variety of topics, and if you search well in the database of JSTOR, you should be able to find some information. You can also utilize YouTube. Sometimes historians, for example, will be debating or at conferences and panel discussions on YouTube, and on your particular area or topic, you might be able to find some information. And then you also can look some more in some of those other databases, and in the library, books are highly recommended. So if you're searching for some type of source and you can't find it, let me know. but sources are really key, and you want to use your best sources for the evaluation of sources. Okay. Also note that you can have an appendix, so if you do have the need to use data, like a data chart, census information, you do have a map, for example, you're looking at a particular battle and you want to address a particular map, you can put that in the appendix. It doesn't count for the word count for your summary of evidence. You can also include excerpts from primary sources and things like that that your reader could check out. And then make sure in your evidence you're not slanted toward one argument, right? This is a different assignment than actually doing an essay where all of your evidence supports one thesis, right? We're so used to doing that type of assignment. In this case, it's almost like you're organizing evidence for two possible thesis statements, and your task is to figure out which one is the better answer to your question. And so you need to be able to have enough evidence on both sides. So make sure that your summary of evidence speaks to that. So on Tuesday, what you should hand in is that you should hand in the evaluation of sources, which is essentially two OPVLs. So kind of think of two short paragraphs that really articulate for each source that you pick, not each of your 8 sources, but each of 2 sources, your origin, purpose, value, and limitations. Okay, so once you have a sense of writing up that, and there's a few samples online, that's the only new piece, but you should also include your summary of evidence, the question, the plan of investigation, and kind of start with the question at the top, do the plan of investigation, the summary of evidence, the evaluation of sources, and then the bibliography of 8 sources. You can, of course, make changes. So if you're doing your evaluation of sources on a source that wasn't previously listed on your bibliography, make the change and try to keep it to 8 sources. And so ultimately you're looking at picking and choosing, your best 8 sources to be able to develop this particular project. Okay. And then there's also a rubric online. I put it on Schoology. You're going to be assessed essentially on the evaluation of sources, but I will give you feedback on all of the parts. Okay. So that way you can get a sense for the alignment and things like that. The next section, the analysis, will work very similarly, where you hand in all of the pieces, but the new part is the analysis. And then the very, very last thing that we do as a class is you edit the entire historical investigation. So the analysis and the conclusion are the last parts. Just to kind of give you an idea of OPVL, and I'll keep this really brief because we've worked on it before. And again, if you have specific questions, you can ask in class. The purpose of OPVL is just to ensure that every single source could potentially have specific values and limitations for your question, and you want to make sure you keep those in mind before using the source. So if I was going to be using the 95 theses, for example, I'd want to know a little bit about the historical context of that, why Luther created it, how he created it, who his audience was, those types of things, because it's a very different source than some of the sources Luther writes later. For example, his scathing piece about what the peasants shouldn't do. That particular piece is much different in its historical context. Okay. So the origin, of course, is probably the shortest and easiest section of the OPVL. This is where you really articulate who the author is, and particular information about the historical context of when and how the source was created. So if this was a source that was a historical site, if this is a source that's a document, if it's an image, whatever the context of the creation of the source is, it speaks to the credibility of the source, and in some cases the historical context of the source. The origin of the source has its own historical context, and that's important. And you may also feel, if you're using a secondary source and the source is an historian, discussing in a sentence the expertise of that historian could be done by showcasing a work that the historian has written. Maybe there's a course that that particular individual teaches. What makes that person a credible person to be able to discuss the content that you're having them discuss. the purpose of the source is always really a focus, because of course, the purpose of the source can sometimes really affect the way you may look at it. Okay, so you might have a source that the purpose is largely to convince a group of people to do something. Maybe it's a speech, maybe it's some type of propaganda tool. So the Crusades brought us to looking at Pope Urban's speech. That was a great opportunity for you all to consider the purpose of a speech, and was the purpose, really to get people to go and, kind of counter the way that, Christians were seeing the Muslims taking over Jerusalem. Was that whole entire source kind of couched in some of that entire issue, and was it a piece of propaganda, in an effort to get people to go? They were told they could, get an indulgence and all those kinds of things. So you want to be able to put the source in its historical context, and that's a big part of the OPVL. And then you can kind of decide, based on what I know about the purpose, does that make the source more valuable, or does that make the source a limitation, right? So, for example, there was a student who was looking at a source related to Rosa Parks and Rosa Parks' role in the Montgomery bus boycott, right? You could certainly look at some of the, pieces of information that were created from the arrest records of Rosa Parks to get a sense of her role, but the purpose of those sources were generally to document by the Montgomery Police Department what Rosa Parks did, and didn't do, on the bus when she wouldn't give up her seat to a white man. Why did she get arrested, and what laws did she break, and things like that. What we don't necessarily, of course, the purpose of that source was to document, and there may also have been some particular, context in the way that the police created that source, information that they wrote down and things that they chose not to put in the police report. So there's things about that purpose that are important, and I might be able to use that analysis of the purpose in my OPVL, in a sense. There is the purpose itself has a value, because we get a sense of kind of what the police department's maybe sense of what Rosa Parks actually did. There's no other better source to really tell me what Rosa Parks perhaps actually did, but at the same time it's limited because it's from the perspective of a police department that may have had particular desire to leave out part of the story, and so it's limited in a sense too. A value, of course, is really, why is the source so useful for your question? If you're doing something where you want to know a question about to what extent maybe Rosa Parks was significant, you might have oral histories from individuals in Montgomery at the time of the bus boycott. There might be particular people's stories that are important to tell, and that might be something that you would want to include. The value then of an oral history becomes really significant for certain questions. Of course, as you can kind of see in the next slide, there's also limitations to oral histories in that they tend to be done after the fact, so could be even decades after the fact. If somebody had an oral history that was transcribed 20 years after an event, there's a dependence that everything that they say is exactly like they remembered it 20 years ago. Something could potentially not be correct. Within the time past, there may have also been some, kind of changes in, public perception of the issue, so they may couch the way they represent it differently than what actually happened at the time. So there's a lot of ways that you can look at both value and limitation kind of together, but one thing to think about is a source valuable in its purpose? Is the source valuable in the actual content that it gives you? Did you learn something from a secondary source that you really, an argument, for example, a way of thinking about a topic that you couldn't have gotten elsewhere? Is there actually a value in the author? That one particular secondary source author is such an expert on a topic, wrote a recent work, and maybe changed the way people think about the topic. When we looked at whether or not, the Renaissance was part of the Middle Ages or its own thing, we looked at Burckhardt as an example of a historian who wrote about the significance of the Renaissance. He would be an important person to have in your bibliography if you were doing that particular topic, because his significance in getting other historians to look at the way that was that topic kind of fell. So There's a variety of different ways you can do value, and of course limitations. So, limitations are all about what about the source hinders your investigation, how is the source in some case limited, and do know that one thing you probably should stay away from in your evaluation of sources, you should not try to put that a source is biased. Okay, be specific why it is biased.